Welcome to Ars Historica. An essential disclaimer. The images you will see are original conceptual recreations generated by AI, based on rigorous bibliographic study. They do not reproduce copyrighted works, but illustrate the principles we will discuss. That said, observe. When we look at Renaissance art, we are captivated by the surface, translucent skin, velvet, the freshness of colors. But this surface beauty hides a dark history. For Western art to reach its apex, artists had to commit what their era considered a desecration. They had to tear the surface. They had to open the dead. Before the 15th century, the interior of the human body was forbidden territory. The Church prohibited human dissection for theological reasons associated with the resurrection of the flesh. But the obstacle wasn't just religious, it was academic. Medieval medicine was entirely based in the texts of Claudius Galen, a 2nd-century Greek physician. Galen had dissected pigs, dogs, and monkeys, extrapolating these anatomies to humans. For 1,000 years, European academia accepted that the human liver had 5 lobes, like a dog's. Doctors read Galen, they did not look at bodies. The written word was the ultimate authority, not observation. This is where the history of art intersects with the history of science. Because the medical academy was paralyzed by dogma, the empirical revolution had to come from the outside. It came from the studios. The Renaissance artist, trained in the bottega, was above all a visual observer. For him, if the text said one thing, but the eye saw another, the eye was right. This epistemological rupture, placing visual evidence above textual authority, is the true essence of humanism. Artists like Pollaiuolo and Andrea del Verrocchio began flaying corpses not to heal, but to understand the mechanics of tension beneath the skin. But investigating on one's own was dangerous. The dismemberment of corpses without official papal sanction bordered on heresy and desecration. Artists needed bodies, and these bodies were not easy to acquire legally. They relied on executed criminals, beggars without families, or dark deals with gravediggers and hospitals in the dead of night. Artistic anatomy was born as a subversive act. When you look at the heroic figures of the Renaissance, you are looking at the result of a crime tolerated for the sake of aesthetics. Beauty depended on transgression. For the Quattrocento artist, the body was no longer a sinful, fallen shell as medieval theology preached. It was the most divine machine ever designed. And if God was the supreme engineer, the dissecting artist was not desecrating the work, he was studying the original blueprint. This shift in mindset allowed investigation to overcome repulsion. They wanted to know not just where a muscle was, but how it pulled the bone, how the joint served as a lever. Art ceased to be merely the imitation of the surface, to become the study of the invisible causes of movement. Of all those who tore the veil, no one went deeper than Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was driven by a pathological curiosity. He didn't just want to know how to paint an arm better. He wanted to understand why the heart beat, how the eye translated light, how life flowed. He planned to write a complete treatise on anatomy in 120 chapters. To this end, he performed over 30 complete human dissections throughout his life. The man who painted The Last Supper spent more time with scalpels than with brushes. Let us strip away Leonardo's mythical aura for a moment and consider the physical reality of his work. There was no refrigeration. There was no formaldehyde. A dissection in Florence or Milan had to be done quickly, in a matter of days, before putrefaction made the environment unbearable and tissues unrecognizable. Leonardo worked at night, often alone, in hospital basements, fighting the stench of decaying corpses, focused only on the structure revealing itself beneath his knife. He writes in his notebooks about the monumental effort of overcoming visceral disgust in order to see the truth. One of the most famous accounts of his studies occurred at the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova. Leonardo spoke with an old man who claimed to be over 100 years old. Hours later, the man passed away peacefully, showing no signs of illness. Leonardo's curiosity was immediate. He dissected the old man to understand what natural death was, and what he discovered changed medical history. He was the first person in human history to describe and draw arteriosclerosis, the thickening of arteries, and liver cirrhosis. Art financed the greatest cardiological discovery of the century. Leonardo quickly realized that words could not describe the complexity of the body. Texts could be misinterpreted. The image was universal. He applied his engineering genius to invent drawing techniques we still use in science today. He invented the exploded view, drawing skull bones separated but aligned, showing how they fit together. He used cross-sections, as if slicing a limb, to show concentric layers of muscle and bone. He drew veins as if they were rivers cutting through the landscape of the body. The modern illustrator was born there, in those notebooks. All this dangerous knowledge had to be protected. Leonardo wrote his anatomical notes using the famous mirror writing, from right to left. Many historians debate why. Being left-handed, it was practical to avoid smudging the ink, but there was also the clear intention of hiding his findings from prying eyes. What he drew directly challenged the official academic medicine of his time. If these notebooks had been published during his lifetime, the history of medicine would have advanced 100 years overnight. Instead, they remained hidden in trunks for centuries, a silent treasure of knowledge. 30 years younger than Leonardo, Michelangelo Buonarroti had a different obsession. He was not interested in arteries or the functioning of internal organs. For him, the human body was the only vehicle capable of expressing the states of the soul. And to express the soul in its heroic and tragic fullness, he needed to absolutely master the architecture of the flesh, the bones and the muscles. Biographer Vasari states that Michelangelo's devotion to dissection was so extreme in his youth that it affected his health and his stomach. He dissected to understand strength and pain. Michelangelo's gateway to anatomy occurred at the convent of Santo Spirito in Florence. At 17, protected by the local prior, he received an extraordinary and secret permission. The convent ran a hospital, and Michelangelo was granted access to the corpses in the morgue during the early hours of the morning. What he saw in the cold of those rooms he transformed into sublime art. As a gesture of gratitude for the invaluable opportunity to study the interior of man, the young man carved a wooden crucifix for the church. The perfection of Christ's muscularity on that crucifix was the direct result of the nights spent with the hospital's dead. When Michelangelo picked up the chisel to attack the Carrara marble, he wasn't carving the surface, he carved from the inside out. His mind projected the three-dimensional skeleton inside the block of stone.
Then he mentally attached the muscles, and only then visualized the skin over it. This is why sculptures like the David or the figures of the Medici tombs possess a vitality that frightened his contemporaries, the so-called terribilità. The static tension we see in the marble is not a stylistic trick. It is the anatomical precision of someone who knows exactly which muscle contracts when the body's weight shifts from one leg to the other. If you look at the countless preparatory drawings that remain of Michelangelo, you will see that they are studies of colliding forces. He exaggerated the musculature because he did not see the body in a relaxed state. He saw the body as a machine in constant opposition to gravity and the passions of the soul. The shoulder doesn't just lift, the deltoid pulls, the collarbone resists, the trapezius tenses. This knowledge cannot be acquired simply by looking at a nude man posing in the studio. One must have seen the naked muscle beneath the blade. The Renaissance didn't just copy nature. Through dissection, it learned nature's source code. Ultimately, Leonardo's discoveries remained hidden, and Michelangelo's unadaic institutional medicine was nil. But the knowledge they acquired in the crypts flowed into the world through their public works. When 16th-century doctors looked at the Sistine Chapel or the Florentine frescoes, they saw an anatomy far more correct than existed in their books of Galen. Art silently became the greatest anatomical atlas in Europe. Artists forced science to look at reality. They proved that to understand the divine, one had to dirty their hands with human flesh.
In 1543, the apex of this union between the chisel and the scalpel occurred. A young Flemish physician named Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, the most important anatomical work in history. But Vesalius's genius lay not only in the dissections he conducted at the University of Padua, it lay in who he hired to draw them. Vesalius did not call upon ordinary illustrators. He sought out the studio of the great Renaissance master Titian. It is believed that Jan van Kalkar, one of Titian's primary students, executed the woodcuts. Medical science finally spoke the language of high art. Dissection left the dark, damp basements and stepped into the spotlight. At the University of Padua and later in Bologna, anatomical theaters emerged. They were funnel-shaped wooden structures where hundreds of students and onlookers leaned over balustrades to watch the professor open the human body. It wasn't just a class, it was a public spectacle, a performance about life and death. Medical knowledge became a theatrical demonstration, and the body, the main stage. The illustrations in Vesalius's work are shocking because they do not appear dead. The so-called muscle men are flaying corpses, but they are alive. They walk through idyllic landscapes of the Veneto region, pose with hands on hips, and lament their own fleshless condition. Their flaying skin often hangs from their arms like the togas of Roman senators. Renaissance art could not treat the human body merely as a biological object. Even stripped of its skin, the body retained its human dignity and its theatrical tragedy. The Catholic Church observed this visual revolution. During the Counter-Reformation, to combat Protestant austerity, the Church realized that this anatomical realism possessed immense emotional power. Anatomical realism was then summoned to glorify the martyrs. When you see a late 16th century Saint Sebastian riddled with arrows, or a Saint Bartholomew holding his own skin, the pain is not symbolic, it is clinically precise.
Artists applied the knowledge of tendons and muscle spasms to make Christian pain viscerally real for the faithful. The scalpel became a theological tool. But every dissection carried with it a grim reminder, memento mori, remember that you will die. The study of anatomy merged with philosophical reflection on mortality. In the still lifes and studios of the time, skulls and bones were arranged alongside books, compasses, and hourglasses. The anatomist was not just mapping the machine, he was confronting the brevity of life. The flesh that Michelangelo glorified and Leonardo mapped was ultimately dust. Anatomy taught the Renaissance the harshest of lessons. Beauty is temporary, and beneath the silk garments we are all identical. This fascination transformed death itself into an autonomous art form. The écorché, the flayed figure, ceased to be merely preparatory study material and became a collectible object of art. Small bronze sculptures of skinless men began to adorn the studios of wealthy patrons in Florence and Rome, displayed alongside classical antiquities. The pain and extreme nudity of anatomy were aestheticized. The wealthy bourgeoisie didn't just want the external perfection of Venus. Now they also coveted the grotesque and sublime internal engineering.
However, as the 16th century progressed into the 17th, the model of the universal artist-scientist began to crumble. Knowledge accumulated to such a point that specialization became inevitable. Medicine established itself as its own rigid academic and controlled discipline. Art also went its own way. Slowly, doctors no longer needed painters to draw their discoveries, inventing their own forms of standardized illustration, and artists left the damp morgue tables to return to clean, comfortable studios. The divorce between art and science was being consummated. Medicine chose objectivity. The body became a mechanism to be repaired, devoid of an aura. Art, on the other hand, chose deep subjectivity. With the arrival of the Baroque, with painters like Caravaggio and sculptors like Bernini, the underlying anatomical structure was there, but the focus was now raw flesh, soft flanks, deep shadows, and psychological drama. The body ceased to be a mere engineering project to be mapped, returning to being the spiritual battlefield between light and darkness. But the legacy of these dark years cannot be erased. The next time you walk through a grand art gallery and stop before a Renaissance master, do not look only at the texture of the velvet or the divine serenity of the face. Look at the subtle curve of the neck, the tension in the forearm, the exact way the weight rests on the pelvis. What you are seeing is not magical, innate talent. You are seeing the result of hundreds of silent nights spent underground with the dead. More than just elevating art to divine heights, the alliance forged between the painter's studio and the morgue founded what we now call the Western scientific method. By insisting that rigorous observation, empirical drawing, and tactile evidence should supplant ancient dogmatic texts, artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo sparked modern observation. Long before the formal scientific revolution, it was the artists who drew the map of our own interior and taught us not to look away from reality.
we cannot contemplate the light of the Renaissance without acknowledging the shadows that made it possible. That period we revere for its intellectual elevation and the rescue of human grandeur was built upon foundations of lifeless flesh and bone, often manipulated in secrecy. The most sublime art in the world required acts that society deemed macabre. And perhaps therein lies the greatest and most poetic paradox of our cultural history. The celestial search for beauty required a visceral, literal, and bloody immersion in our most earthly mortality. What happened to those who led this transgression? Michelangelo continued to produce until the end of his long life, sculpting with a force that transcended anatomy, where the spirit, in his final pietas, seemed to finally want to tear through and abandon the flesh he studied so obsessively. And Leonardo? He passed away in France. His thousands of anatomical notebooks, filled with discoveries that would have advanced cardiology and biomechanics by centuries, were stored away, forgotten, and dispersed into private collections. The world, tragically, was not prepared for an artist's science. Today, as we observe medical diagrams on ultra-high-definition screens, we are still employing the exact visual grammar forged in those stuffy studios. Cross-sections, exploded perspectives, arterial maps that mimic riverbeds. All of this is art acting as the silent foundation of empirical medicine. Artists did not merely reproduce the surface of the world, they forged the essential lens through which science could for the first time scrutinize the human body, stripped of the dogmas of the past. In this way, anatomy, once forbidden and cursed, arose as the backbone of our understanding of the living being. We owe the beginnings of our life-saving medicine and the greatest aesthetic triumphs of the West to the same transgressive drive, the obstinacy to see the naked truth. Therefore, the next time a Renaissance work of art ravishes your senses with its ideal proportion, remember the tombs and the scalpel. Remember that illusory perfection rests upon the rigorous dissection of reality. We have reached the end of another rigorous investigation here on Ars Historica. If this immersion into the roots of art and science has broadened your vision, I ask that you strengthen our project, subscribe to the channel, leave your rating, and crucially, participate in the academic debate in the comments. We would like to read your reflection. Do you believe that artistic genius justifies the breaking of ethical paradigms of its time? Share this video with those who seek history beyond the surface. And I will see you in the next episode.